So, welcome, I'm here with Millie and we're going to be talking about neuroplasticity.
Well, that's right. I love talking about neuroplasticity. We did a brain introduction video before and we got started on the topic, but we didn't really explain it. So we're going to unpack neuroplasticity and what it really means. So basically our neurons and our brain is organized because we need to be able to efficiently send messages to each neuron in our brain. So it's organized into what we like to call pathways in our brain. So we have these pathways and these ways of thinking that allow us to predict so that we don't use up all our brain power going, what is happening? We can predict behavior that allow us to quickly jump into a mindset, that allow us to remember how to do our jobs, that allow us to remember to drink. We have these pathways in our brain and they're very useful. Most of the time, they're incredibly functional. So our brain is very organized and that's what we need. But neuroplasticity refers to the ability for the brain to organize itself. And this is commonly used in trauma terms. So if you've had trauma, and particularly like a physical trauma, like your brain has been hit by something, you've had a car accident or something like this, and your brain is damaged, what happens is your brain begins to compensate with other areas of the brain and it begins to create new neural connections in a different area of the brain, one that hasn't been traumatized or one that hasn't been impacted. And you create these new neural pathways in your brain. And that's what neuroplasticity is. It's the ability of your brain to reorganize itself, reorganize its synapses, reorganize what's going on to cope with what's happened to it. And this can definitely be used in physical and mental, emotional trauma. We like to use this in psychology. You can use this in your brain training to make sure that you're always sharp, you're always on top of things. But basically how you do this, we've got a few steps on how to do this. So you have to be in the right mood, first of all. Because you have a lot of moods. I know sometimes when I'm not in the right mood, when I'm tired, I'm not going to be able to sit down and train my brain.
That's right. Focus.
Exactly. Yeah. I'm not focused. I'm everywhere. So you've got to make sure you're basically in the right mood. You're creating the right environment to be able to make these changes and you're sufficiently motivated to make these changes. So you're not sitting there going, oh, I can't be bothered doing anything. Why won't my brain just change itself? And I've been there. We've all been there. But you need to be motivated because it is hard to make that start and it is hard to begin to change these areas of your life. But you have to do that by learning. So basically, I know a lot of people don't like to know this, but it is by learning and you retrain your brain and your brain retrains itself in a lot of ways by learning a new activity, learning a new skill, learning a new way of thinking, and then realizing that your brain isn't going to change just like that. But it's repeatedly thinking about these things. I think you mentioned this in the introduction video as well, how you were talking about the fact that these pathways are deeply entrenched in us. We've probably thought about them over and over again. Yeah. When you think about it, like I like to run. So when I go running through the forest or whatnot, I always stick to the paths. But every now and again you find a path that someone has taken, maybe once or twice, and it's not easy to follow that path because you can't really see it. But the more that you travel down that path, the more that people travel down that path, the wider the path gets, the easier it is to run on that path. And it's just like that with your brain. Your brain needs to use that pathway over and over and over again. You do that via learning. You do that via practice and using that over and over again to create these pathways. So think about what you want to do. Think about what area of your life that you want to change and begin to create that pathway and then begin to learn, begin to accumulate things to that pathway. So it's easier for your brain to use that. It's easier for your brain to predict what's going to happen next and just use that pathway over and over again. Begin to cut away some of the things that you don't need and just focus on what you do need there. So those are a few tips to changing some of the pathways in your brain, and we're going to go into detail in later episodes about specific things like where you need to train your brain specifically, what you need to do to make these changes, to even begin to forge some of these changes. But that's a bit of a quick overview on that. What do you think, Luisa?
Yeah, I have, worked particularly with cognitive behavioural therapy and sort of supporting people sort of reprogram their thinking and create new neural pathways or new thought patterns. And like Millie says, it actually requires a conscious decision.
That's right.
To actually address and challenge and create alternative ways of thinking, but also alternative beliefs. Why it's so hard for many people to actually address their mindsets is when, for instance, you're running the same course over and over again every day, you create a memory, right? And even a physical memory.
That's right.
To the point where you're actually doing it almost unconsciously. Because you've actually it's become embedded, not just in your mental memory, in your physical memory. And one of the things that happens when you start to form beliefs as a child, which is heavily influenced by our experiences, is that sometimes our beliefs can be a little bit distorted. And then those distorted beliefs become embedded.
That's right.
And that becomes difficult to shift because we ourselves might not recognize them. We might not recognize that some of our thinking patterns are very rigid. They're very entrenched. So they require, one, recognition, identifying what are these thinking patterns, and also starting to challenge them and create alternative ways of looking at situations and people. So it's a very big area, and like Millie said, we're going to be exploring this in greater depth, and also looking at some of those thinking distortions, actually looking at how to challenge them, thinking about even looking at alternative ways of looking at situations and people and beliefs.
I think it's important as well to note that this kind of neuroplasticity goes both ways.
Yes.
So you can have positive change, you can make positive changes, but you can also make really negative changes. So you have the power within your hands. And I think that that's an incredible thing to realize, is that you're not a victim anymore. You can take a hold of what's going on in your brain and create changes, and you can create positive changes. But you can also create negative changes. So it's also about being wary of not letting negative thoughts in and not letting negative thoughts dominate. Because the more you're letting these negative thoughts dominate, the easier it is to fall into that cycle. I know personally when I'm offended or angry at something, you go over it in your head. And then you go over it in your head, and then you go over it more and more and more in your head, thinking about different scenarios. Well, I know as a female, we do that all the time. But that is something that's quite easy to fall into because it's quite a cycle. Then you realize that you've spent a couple of hours thinking about it and stewing over it. And it just creates quite a negative cycle in your brain, but that has physiological changes in your body. It causes you to excrete cortisol. It changes the hormonal imbalance in your body because your brain controls the rest of your body. So it's important to realize here that you have the power to create good changes in your mind and good changes in your body, but also to be wary of the fact that you could be creating negative changes by the things that you choose to dwell on.
And that's it. Neuroplasticity 101 in a nutshell.